Hi, I'm Tony Northrup, and for my book Stunning Digital Photography, I'd like to show you the basics of editing a landscape photo. Let's get started. Let's start with this nice picture in Lucerne, Switzerland. The first thing I want to do is just straighten it out because, as always, you just need to straighten out pictures. You can see this image has vertical lines in that tower, and I'm going to just use the crop tool here to rotate it until those vertical lines line up with the grid lines. There we go. You can see it was just a little off level, but it was enough to notice it. Up next, I need to remove sensor dust like this. You know, I'm traveling and you just always get sensor dust on your cameras. You can't ever keep them clean. So I'm just going to use the spot removal tool. Another setting that I set for just about every landscape picture is profile correction. Under the lens corrections settings here, I'm just going to select the profile correction tool. And you can see it tries to automatically pick my lens and apply the right profile to it, but this is with the profile correction on and off. You can see my lens, even though it's a good quality lens, it has a little bit of pin cushioning. So as I turn that on, it's just straightening lines out and correcting for the natural distortions in that specific lens's optics. So I pretty much turn on profile correction for every picture that I make. Now looking at the histogram, it looks pretty good. You can see there's not quite anything touching the right side there, so I think I'll raise the whites a little bit. And while the histogram is pretty well spaced out, it still looks a little washed out. Maybe it's those mountains in the background, so I'll try tweaking the contrast a little bit. This was a sunset picture, and so what I like about it is it has that sunset look. Alright, so I'll just drop those lights down a little bit. And there we go. So by upping the contrast, I really helped exaggerate the sunset effect of it. Going back through the history, we can see what we started with and then what we ended up with. And you can see just those few little changes made a big difference in the picture. Here's another picture from Lucerne, and I took it in the same trip, and you can see I even have the same bit of sensor dust. Now we have straight lines in here because we have water and a horizon, but you know, looking at the grid lines here in the rotate tool, it looks pretty straight to me. Now this is a nice picture, but there's a lot of boring space up here, and the focal point is kind of moving off the right side of the frame, so it might benefit me just to crop it a little differently. This focuses your attention on the boats and the mountains in the background. Now looking at the histogram, we can see this is not a very contrasty picture, just because as you can see, the sky was really cloudy and therefore the lighting is flat, but you can see the histogram has all the information right in the middle of the picture. So I'm going to bump the contrast up to spread that histogram out and add some more contrast to the picture. You can see the histogram in the upper right corner just moving out towards the edges where it belongs. That's pretty good. You can see we're not quite touching the left side yet, and I like to touch the left side, put some blacks in there. Now to my eye, the boat's a little washed out, so I'm just going to pull the highlights down a little bit because I don't want that boat to be too washed out. It's a little bright right now. Alright, so I adjusted the highlights down, got some nice blacks in there. That's looking much nicer already. I'm happy with the colors too, so I'll just enable profile corrections to straighten it out a little bit more, and I think I'm happy with that photo. It didn't take much work at all. This was a beautiful scene in the Swiss Alps. I just pulled the car over to grab this shot, and I can see a lot of potential in this shot, but it does need some work. So I think I'll start with the crop because this is all a distraction. So I'm just going to pull that in and compose it so the tower is aligned along with the rule of thirds. You can see Lightroom is nice enough to give me a nice vertical grid here to show me exactly where the rule of thirds would place it. There we go. Now that's a much nicer crop. Looking at the histogram, I can see a problem here. You can see if I hover the cursor over this little arrow, it shows in red everything that's blown out, that's overexposed. And that sky is just completely blown out. I didn't have good weather. I just had completely overcast skies, and that's how it goes sometimes when you travel. But I can recover those highlights. Now I can pull those highlights down. Oh, and look at that. We can start to see some detail in the clouds. That's cool. I bet if I were to pull the exposure down more. Yeah, look, see, there's actually some clouds in there. So it was completely blown out before, but because I shot raw, we can start to see detail in those clouds. So here's a challenge I have. I like the foreground to be nice and bright, but as I drop the exposure, I can see that the mountains and the clouds look much better. So it doesn't feel like there's one exposure that's right for this entire picture. So I'll show you a trick that I often do. I'm going to go back into the library mode, and then I'm going to create a virtual copy of this. I just right-clicked it and then selected create virtual copy. So now I have two copies of the same picture. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust one of these pictures for the mountains and the sky in the background there. This is basically bracketing in post. So I'm just tweaking the contrast and the whites and the blacks just for the mountains and the skies here. I'm going to use this part from this virtual copy and then use the foreground from the other virtual copy. So the mountains look great there. Now I'm going to process this image and use the foreground for it. So I'm going to drop those blacks and add a little more contrast here too. Maybe I'll make it even brighter. Make it nice and contrasty. Something I don't like about the foreground here is this grass looks very just yellow, and it was mostly brown. Even in the Alps, they don't have perfectly green grass all the time, but I'll show you a trick that I use often, and I'll just use the color tool here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take the yellows, and I'm going to push the hue towards the green. Oh, look at that. It's kind of cheating, because I'm making the grass look better than it really looked in real life. But I'm just going to pull it up. I'm adjusting the hue from yellow to green, so it's taking all that yellow grass and making it green. And I think I'll drop the saturation down a little bit because I don't want to overdo it. I don't want to make it look too like lime. There we go. So dropping the saturation and the luminance down, just giving it a nice green color. Sometimes I'll do it with the oranges too. There we go. So you can see this is what I started with, and then bam, nice green colors, lots more contrast. Great, so flipping between the two copies of the same picture that I have, this one is exposed for the sky, and this one is exposed for the foreground, but you can see the sky is completely blown out. Now I'm just going to combine these two pictures in Photoshop. So I'll select them both, right-click them, select Edit In, and then select Open as Layers in Photoshop. Now you can see Photoshop has nicely aligned the two copies of the same image as different layers. If I click this icon, I'll hide that layer and we can see the foreground hidden below it. Now we use masking to show and hide parts of this top layer. I'll click the mask button down here at the bottom. Now we use the quick selection tool to select this bottom part of the landscape. So now with my mask selected, I'm using my paint bucket tool here. You can see the color is set to black, and I'll just fill it in. That's not a bad start, but you can see the edge here looks pretty rough. So I need to blend those a little bit better. I'll go back to my selection tool and just select this whole background. And now I think I'll use the gradient tool. You can see I have it selected so it'll paint from black to white. So all I need to do is to drag the tool from the place where I want the layer mask to be black down here. Black will be hidden, up to where I want it to be white up here. There we go. That's a much more natural effect. I'll just Alt-click the layer mask to show you what the layer mask itself looks like. As you can see, I just painted white the parts of the layer mask that I wanted to show the background picture in, and everything that's black shows through to the bottom layer, which actually shows the foreground. So you can see the layer mask there is revealing the steeple and then gradually blending the background into the foreground. I'll Alt-click that again to turn that off, and then we'll switch back to the foreground layer here, because I see one other thing I'd like to fix, and it's this power line here. Oh, what a nuisance in the modern world. They just decided to string lines up across everything beautiful. Fortunately, it's fairly easy to fix in Photoshop. I'm going to use the polygonal lasso tool here, and because it's mostly a straight line, this makes it fairly easy to select. I'm just going to make sure I select the entire area, and then press Shift F5 to use the Content Aware tool and have Photoshop try to automatically fill it in with me. And you can see it did a pretty good job. You can kind of see the presence of the line there. So I usually go back with a clone stamping tool. I pressed S to use the stamp tool. So then I Alt-click somewhere, and now I can just kind of fill this area in. All right, that looks pretty natural. I don't think anybody's ever going to notice that. Here's the before image, and here's the after image. Pretty dramatic difference just a few minutes of editing can make.